when Italy was created, the commentary was from an Italian statesman, we've made Italy, now we must make Italians. And are we in a situation now where we've made Europe, but we need to make Europeans?
David Cameron seems to have bought time or run away from this fiscal union treaty, which is now an intergovernmental treaty in Britain. Will we get a referendum on it? Will the referendum lock apply? Will you get opt-outs, or will we be cast aside? I'd like to know, what direction you're taking. What roadmap have you got on this?
How are you going to inspire trust and support of the European citizens back to the EU and Eurozone?
I'm afraid there are more and more diverging narratives between Britain and most countries on the continent. For many Brits, for a growing number of British Conservatives, in fact, Brussels stands for 20th century type bureaucracy with funny French and German accents. Whereas, for many of us continentals, Britain looks stuck in the 19th century. A country that just doesn't seem to understand the necessities of growing together. So how do we cope with this? How do we bring the narratives together? Because I think this is not a healthy situation.
Let me deal with the sort of narrow point of the Fiscal Treaty first. I mean, David Cameron went into that meeting believing that the best option was to get a treaty at 27, but we'd always made it very clear that there were certain safeguards for the single market, and particularly for the single market on financial services, that we wanted to achieve in order to get that. Now, those are not forthcoming. A lot of countries were willing to agree to that. There were no British carve-outs or opt-outs that were asked for. But there were one or two countries, one in particular that was determined not to agree to the safeguards we wanted, and it was not possible to agree a treaty at 27. Now, the Fiscal Treaty includes an aspiration to roll it into the Lisbon treaties within 5 years. Now, if there is such a proposal, obviously that becomes part of the treaty amendment process laid down in the Lisbon Treaty. There would have to be the usual negotiations and unanimous agreement in order for that to go through. And I can't predict, what at this stage what might or might not be the outcome of that. Would there be a British referendum? That would depend on whether the outcome of any future treaty negotiations triggered the referendum provisions of the European Union Act 2011, which basically says if you transfer extra power or competence from the UK to the EU, and I stress the UK to the EU, then a referendum would be required. But for example, with the ESM ratification, which we shall be introducing fairly soon after the Queen's speech as primary legislation, there is not a need for a referendum because that does not apply to the United Kingdom. So that is subject to an exemption under our referendum lock. In response to the more general point that was made to me, well, let me start by a bit of recent history, because before we get on to the narrative, you're being deliberately provocative, and I'm going to be slightly deliberately provocative back. The narrative of divergent paths. Let's not forget, two of the greatest achievements by anybody's book, and certainly in the centre-right book of the European Union in its history, have been the creation of the single market and the enlargement of the European Union eastwards after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Both of those were in very large measure due to British inspiration and British leadership and British involvement in shaping the European agenda. I could be happy to stand up and say that Margaret Thatcher's Bruges speech was one of the great speeches about European unity in the post-war period, because at a time when it was not fashionable, it was not actually believable, she talked about Prague and Warsaw as being as much main European cities as Paris or London. And similarly, with the single market was the greatest transfer of competencies and pooling of decision-taking that there's been in the EU's history. That would not have been possible without Arthur Cockfield, with Margaret Thatcher's political support. So where we believe that it is in certainly our interest, and in the common interest, we have shown that we have been prepared to help shape the European project in what we believe is the way that suits the challenges of the modern world. And I think we're applying a similar approach now. The world is becoming multipolar. The world is, through a mixture of technology and the emergence of different poles of power, becoming much more like a network of different economic and political centres. And we need to have a European Union that is able to cope with those things, that uses the common leverage of a single voice on trade to get the best possible bargain, even though we all know we'll fight like cats in a sack for our own national firms once we've got the market access to China and it's down to competing for individual contracts. And why we need to embrace the opportunities of globalization and the huge new markets that brings to us. 10% of the population of China getting European-level consumer spending power is a massive opportunity for us, and we should see it as that and not as a threat. But to come on to the issue that bridges that question about the Italians and Italy, to what extent, if I go back to Greek political terms, to what extent is there a genuine European demos? That would mean that a European polis was truly democratically accountable. And it's not straightforward. I mean, last year over Libya, we had a straightforward, profound difference of opinion between the big European countries about what the right course of action was. And I just don't see how that decision could have been resolved through a QMV on foreign policy and security policy in a way that left everybody feeling this was happy. If you're coming to the deployment of troops, how does that fit in? If I don't like the economic policies of the people running my country, how do I get rid of them and elect somebody else? That seems to me a question. And do people in the European Union feel sufficient sense of European identity and allegiance to actually feel that it's okay, those decisions can be taken at the supranational level, and elections to the European Parliament or the elections that some are proposing for a elected president of the Commission are a proper way for democratic accountability, which everybody then consents to, whatever the result. Whereas I suspect at the moment European Parliament elections are still determined country by country on the basis of the standing of political parties and national governments within those countries, and not on the basis of some sense of European policy as a whole. So it's not just British cussedness. I worry about even countries more enthusiastic than I am taking that step at the risk that you simply alienate people who think it's not democratic, and you give support not to democratic parties but to the more ultra political parties who resort to pretty hardline atavistic nationalism.
Let me address the question for trust. I think the treaty is a step, as the Irish Prime Minister has just told us. It's a fundamental step in building trust in financial markets, in rating agencies, in economies worldwide. But it is a step, it is not the solution. The solution are the reforms the different countries are taking. And I've seen a recent study made by a central bank indicating that if we coordinate the reforms, if we put the reforms that are now being considered in some countries in terms of labor law, in terms of competition law, in terms of opening up the different markets, if we coordinate this and if we do this at the same time in different countries of Europe, the result could be much higher and much more positive than if we do it on a national situation, each country by itself and without European coordination. Regarding the making Europe and making Europeans, I think one of the things Portuguese people feel about Europe is lack of accountability. introducing democratic election into some European officials' process of selection would be a way to increase this kind of accountability and to increase this kind of feeling to belong to a common union and to a common political union.
Let me tackle the interesting question about being a national of a member state, a European, and with your reference to Italy and Italians. We try to talk about the added value of Europe. What kind of rights may Europe add to your national rights? We are talking about, for example, the fact that an Irishman goes to a country in Africa where there is no Irish embassy, so he may address, if he has got a problem, to another European embassy. Well, it's an added value, being a European. So I think we have to encourage to our citizens this idea that belonging to Europe and being a European doesn't mean that you do not feel patriotic towards your country. Nothing to do. I think it's a complementary, and I think, as I said before, it is an added value. When it comes to trust, and it's a very interesting issue, I do believe that the financial crisis we are suffering now, there is a component which is called trust. If you look at the figures, we are in difficulties, some more, some less. We are all doing great efforts. Take my country, for example. We have the highest majority that the center-right party ever got in his life. We have a majority in nearly all the regions. We have a prime minister determined to do the reforms. I think what's lacking is that in the euro, there is a lack of trust from some commentators, from some media, about the fate of the whole history. Some people believe, and some investors follow, that the euro is not politically sufficiently strong, that there is no political will behind, and that maybe one day one country may get out of the euro, or the euro will not succeed. So I think that our main task now is to explain that the failure of the Europe is the failure of the European Union. And there is no European Union without Europe. And to give reasons for that. And also to give decisive actions. And to our friends very much concerned about the UK, and I know I cannot compete with an Englishman in Dublin, but my advice is not to despair. No. I'm just going to quote a very famous German poet, Heinrich Heine, when once he was asked, "Where would you like to die?" And people expected him to mention France, where he lived, or Italy, but he said, surprisingly, in the United Kingdom. Why? He said, well, because everything happens a century late. Well, so it will happen.